To write HTML in CodePen, we don't actually have to put the whole head and body thing. We can just start making the body. So let's do that. Let's just put a paragraph in here. What's that called, what I just did? Yeah, not a paragraph. What's it called? Say again? It's a tag. Yeah. What's this? It's a closing tag. Those are both tags. And this entire thing would be a paragraph element. So the elements are the things that make up the DOM, the document object model. Thankfully, we don't have document.all and document.layers anymore. We have a standard object model. So our HTML, after the browser parses it, gets turned into this representation of the document called the DOM. And even if you screw up your HTML, it'll do its best to build the DOM. And that's the thing you can actually interact with. You're not really interacting with the HTML. You're interacting with the object model that it creates from the HTML. So let's make a paragraph. So this, everything between the opening and closing tags, that's the content, or the contents of the paragraph element. And it could contain other elements too. Yeah. All just part of the content of that element. Look, it's rendering down here. We see I put emphasis around this, so it's italicized. Neato. Yes, but I was one of those proprietary tags that Netscape added. And generally speaking, we want our HTML to describe the structure of the page and not the presentation. So italics, that's a pure presentational element. So we prefer EM for emphasis. That way also screen readers and things, for people who need assistive technology, it'll read it differently because it's meant to be emphasized.
So it's going to display differently?
It might not display differently, but it might be different in screen readers. And we just prefer to use these. Yeah, the a more modern, standard way. Yeah, Alex.
On somewhat the same note, so have they come up with standards now that's like so that different browsers can't just put in random HTML?
Well, there's nothing stopping them from doing that, but the good news is most of the browsers do support standard HTML5, even if they do extend it. But for the most part, they don't. They add new features other ways. There are sometimes parts of JavaScript that they support that are new, but they generally all support the standard portions the same way. So, it's a better world than it used to be in that respect. Not in every respect. And we could do that. We could put line break in there. Doesn't make any difference. All right, let's put something else there. So the uses of JavaScript that I described in that presentation, things like when you move your mouse over, the image should change. When you click a button on this little calculator, a number should go in the text field. When you hit enter, it should calculate something. When you submit a form, it should check whether your input was valid. All of these take the form. When something happens, do something else. So you could write some JavaScript that just runs as soon as the page loads. But much of the time, what we're going to do happens in response to some sort of action occurring on the page. So the what here, when something happens, that's an event. And when it happens, we're going to have to tell it how to react to the event. So we need to tell the page to start listening for some event to occur, for it to occur to something or on something. So how about we add a button to the page? Button. Predictable enough, opening, closing tag. The text we want on the button, we'll just put in between the two as the contents. Click me. There it is. So what do? We want to make it so that something happens when we click that button. When the button is clicked, do something. Well, before we can start doing anything to the button, we need to be able to grab the button with JavaScript. We have a number of ways of doing so. One way, one nice modern way, would be to use document. This is how we get to the DOM, which again is the representation of our document, dot query selector. That's a function. Who's used document query selector before? Anybody? So it takes a string as its argument, and that argument is something called a selector, which is what you use in CSS to target elements for a particular style. And that's how we can grab them this way too. The simplest possible selector would be to just put the tag name in there, the type of element that it is. Button. In CSS, a selector that just says button would grab every button on the page. With document query selector, it would grab the first one it comes to, the first match. If you want them all, you can use query selector all. And that will return an array-like thing. It's technically something called a node list, but you can access it with square brackets like you could an array. But query selector will give you just the first match, and that seems good enough for now. So we have our button. Let's save it to a variable. Const btn equals document query selector button. Now slow down there, Uncle Davey. You said variable and you wrote const. What gives? Well, back in the old days, ES5 and earlier, you would use var. But var has some issues related to how they're scoped. And in ES6, we have two new keywords, let and const. And they handle variable scope a little better. So we'll get more into what that means when we start dealing with functions a little bit more, probably tomorrow. But for right now, in ES6 and later, we just don't mess with var anymore. It's always let or const. And it's always const unless we know we need to use let, because it can save us a lot of errors. So consts are not actually constant. The difference between const and let is that consts cannot be completely reassigned. I could not say btn equals something completely different. But I could mutate it. I could change it, as long as I change it in place. I just can't completely reassign it. So for those rare occasions when you totally need to reassign something, use let. We'll talk about more of what those examples might be when we actually have occasion to use them. But one example would be a counter inside a for loop. You need to say let I equals 0, not const I equals 0, because it's going to be reassigned every time through the loop. That's probably the first occasion we'll have to use let. For right now, we'll just get in the habit of always using const. Great, so we have a button. Whoop-de-doo. What can we do with that? When something happens, do something else. So when some event occurs, we have several ways of saying when an event occurs to that button. One way, all HTML elements, and that's what this is, have a property that we can access with a dot called OnClick, all lowercase. JavaScript is case sensitive, and as a general rule, things are camel cased, but some of the stuff that was there in that initial 10-day sprint that Brendan Ike did are pretty inconsistent. So deal with it. btn.onClick, and that's just a property that we can set to something. Now we know the event, click. How do we tell it what to do? We can assign that to a function. So let's write a function. Function, say yeah. Alert, yeah. So we could set btn.onClick equal to say yeah. Not say yeah parentheses, yeah. Because what would that do? If I actually execute this here, then what's on the right side of the equal sign really? Whatever the return value of say yeah is. We didn't return anything explicitly, so it's undefined. So we just set button on click to undefined, which doesn't really do us any good. We want to actually assign the function itself to the OnClick property. Because functions are basically just variables. You can pass them around as arguments to other functions. You can assign them to variables. I could totally do this. I could say const do the thing equals say yeah. And then run do the thing. Yeah. Totally works. It is just as though we had a local variable called say yeah that just happened to be a function. We can call it with open close parens, or we can just assign it to other stuff, like assigning it to the OnClick property of a button. Because that's what it expects. It expects the thing on the right side of the equal sign to be a function. We don't execute it. JavaScript executes it for us at the appropriate time. Let's see if it's all true. Click. Yeah. Totally works. Very nice. There's another way we can do this. A more modern way. Slight issue with doing it this way. Maybe you have more than one action that you want to occur when that thing is clicked. Well, if you just keep setting the OnClick property, you're completely reassigning it every time. So if we assigned another new function to this, we would blow away whatever was there before. But there's another way. So when we start listening for an event to occur, we add something called an event listener. And that's what we're doing here. We're adding an event listener. So something is waiting for that click to happen, and then we tell it how to handle it when it does. So we assign a function that's called the event handler. So instead of saying onClick equals something, we could say btn dot add event listener. And add event listener needs to know a couple of things. The two things that are in that wallpaper. When what happens, it needs to know the event to listen for, because we no longer are saying onClick, and it needs to know what to do. So the first argument to add event listener is the event. Click in this case. When what happens? When click happens. When click happens to what? The thing we added the event listener to, the button. And the second argument is the event handler, the thing that should run when that event finally occurs. In this case, the function say yeah. Not say yeah, open close parens. We're not executing it. Yeah. We're just telling it to execute it later when a certain event occurs. Does it work? Yeah. Still works. So we'll see about 1 trillion more examples of this over the next week or so, and more yet this afternoon. Right now, we're about halfway through the afternoon session, so let's go ahead and take a 10-minute break before we all explode. Come back, fire it up, ready to learn more. Okay? Okay, see you in 10.